So good day, everyone. I'm glad to be here today for your third session about the EU Green Deal and Farm to Fork strategy and all the impacts it will have on your business. And my name is Stefanie Wunder. I'm from the Ecologic Institute here based in Berlin. And it's probably quite helpful if I do a tiny introduction of myself, because I think different to the other speakers, I partly come from a different world, so to say. And I think that the perspective I have on the Farm to Fork strategy, on the Green Deal, and the possible implications that will have on your business might be quite different from what you often hear, and hopefully still helpful. So the Ecologic Institute, where I work, is a private non-for-profit research institute for applied environmental research and policy consultancy. We're working in Germany, but a lot in Europe, partly also international. And I do coordinate our work around food and sustainable land use. And I'm also part of an expert group that was set up by the European Commission about the legislative framework or building blocks for a legislative framework for the Farm to Fork strategy that was taking place since March. It is now coming to an end. We're also part of the EU Food Policy Coalition. So you see, it's pretty much the policy perspective, and it's pretty much the environmental and sustainability glasses that I have with me. So coming from that expertise and work, what I would love to do with you, and the kind of journey I would love to take you through is, I know that you have learned a lot already about the Green Deal and partly also around the Farm to Fork. And of course, it's good to know, what's written down and what targets there are. But I would love to start a little bit earlier and would like to talk with you about the drivers actually behind the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy, because understanding these drivers and then comparing them with what is already in the strategy and in the Green Deal, and allows you then to get a better idea what other steps may or will come in the future. So I think that's quite helpful to anticipate that, and so also then anticipate the potential risks for your business, but also the opportunities. So this is why I will do then, 3 parts of this presentation. First, understanding the drivers, then getting an overview of what's already agreed in the Farm to Fork and the Green Deal, and then, have a little bit of a look in the glass ball, like, what may come next and what this may mean to your business. So let's start with understanding the drivers. Still here in home office, so of course the whole corona pandemic has a lot of impact on us, but the challenges that we still see from the recession that will come, climate change, biodiversity, are so much bigger and so much more fundamental even, that it's quite important to talk about that. So of course, I know climate crisis, climate change, that's in debate everywhere, from Fridays to Future to media. No doubt about that. So I won't really say that it is an issue. I'm sure you're all aware of that. But it's still quite helpful to really step back a little bit and have a look at what time we're living in. It's called the Holocene. The Holocene is, the Earth has a past of 4 billion years, right? I mean, it's difficult to imagine, like, the whole, what happened afterwards. And even this graph here is only looking back at the last 20,000 years. And what you see there in the last 10,000 years, this Holocene, is actually where everything we know has taken place, from civilization to building cities to agriculture. That's the last 10,000 years. This is because we had a very stable climate, right? And you see, if you look to the left side, like even 3 degrees less meant an ice age, right? And now with the rise that you see on the right-hand side of, we're already like 1.2 degrees above the normal. It is super difficult to remain in that 1.5 degree warming that was agreed in Paris, as you remember, to avoid dangerous climate change. So there's just very little room to maneuver to keep within this target. And it really it's the next 5 years that are actually crucial. And we really need to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions in that time. Similarly, biodiversity crisis is just as important. And again, here it's helpful to step back and look back. Probably many of you have children, so if you're taking out this book about dinosaurs, and when they went to extinction, that was 65 million years ago, and that was the 5th mass extinction we have seen on Earth. And we're now in the 6th mass extinction that we see, and it's all due to human impacts. So the approximate number of species that are threatened with extinction is 1 million, right? And this is to a large part due to agriculture. So agriculture is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. And of course, it's not just climate, it's not just biodiversity, it's also, as we see here, what we call the planetary boundaries. So really like what our Earth is able to keep up with in terms of biodiversity loss before we have like crossing thresholds and tipping points, like melting glaciers and stuff. So things you can't take back. There are also other areas in these planetary boundaries, most importantly, like the phosphorus and the nitrogen cycle, that I don't need to tell you are largely connected to the food system. They are also like very close to exceeding, these boundaries. And last but not least, if we talk about food, we also talk about method health impacts. So we have this weird situation that we have 200 million people starving, and we have 2 billion people overweight and obese, which also, despite the human suffering, also brings large cost to the health sector. So to kind of wrap this up, we see that there is a large need to act due to a lot of reasons. So health, biodiversity, climate, planetary boundaries, and really to look at food systems in a more integrated way, and not just production, consumption, but to have this integrated perspective. So that is like kind of scientifically agreed. So that was also the momentum for the Green Deal being agreed at the end of 2019. And there's obviously also a lot of other things in the Green Deal, like about mobility and energy and resource efficiency, but it's also about agriculture and food. And for the first time is really that the EU has set a framework, a strategy that has this integrative perspective in food. Because beforehand it was always agriculture, the common agriculture policy, a little bit on consumption, but nothing really in an integrated way. So the background or the drivers, like really from an EU perspective, obviously they are very similar to what I have just described for the global drivers, but of course for the EU food system and for the EU policy makers, there were also like other reasons, as you see here, when it comes to social sustainability, we're also talking about like social rights for workers, talking about better standards, but still affordable food. Let's not forget about animal welfare, but that's less important for you as produce marketing. And it's also about, as you can see here in economic sustainability, fairer incomes for farmers, but also creating new business and job opportunities. So that was what EU policymakers had in mind when setting up not just the Farm to Fork strategy. I come in a second, like as a reminder to the key targets in there, but also the biodiversity strategy. And probably I have talked less about the biodiversity strategy, and I, just, put like 3 highlights. For example, a part in there is like to plant over 3 billion diverse rich trees. I don't know, that could, nobody really has thought that through. It might also be that we're talking about like agroforestry system with nuts and fruits and all that kind of stuff, which obviously then would have an impact on the production side there. We're talking about like 30% at least land in protected areas, and also like biodiversity rich landscape features on at least 10% of the farmland. So, all these targets in the biodiversity strategy obviously also have an impact on agriculture. And I'm saying all that, coming back to that later, because like if we set standards here in the EU, sooner or later they will also be applied to what we see in imports, in terms of that we talk about similar standards. So the key targets for the farm to fork strategy are 50% reduction in chemical pesticides, 50% less nutrient losses, so reduction of fertilizers by at least 20%, reducing the sales of antimicrobials, and to increase actually the agricultural land that is under organic farming to 25%. So at least 3 of those super important for you to know, as you certainly already do. And of course, the farm to fork has a huge annex, just picking out 2 here. Obviously the revision of the sustainable use of pesticide directive, but also, and that's now coming to an end, to develop a EU code for responsible business and marketing. So just 2 examples, and most importantly, until 2023, there will be a legislative framework for the farm to fork strategy, because right now we're talking about targets. Nothing of that is yet set in stone in terms of legislation. So that will be very important. And now I would love to come to the part that is probably most important for you, because what does that already, what has it been agreed? What does it mean to my business? But also like, what's coming next? Because I know that many of you is like, okay, Europe is coming up with new standards. What would that mean? Will that restrict access to the market for us? What may come next? If we change our business, should we already take next steps? So I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, though I don't know them as well as you do. So that's why I'm already glad for the questions afterwards. So maybe first a little kind of reflection, recap of what I've just said about the farm to fork. So from our perspective, those scientists that see the drivers, the pressures, and see what has been done in terms of policy and strategy. So we think it's a remarkable first step towards the needed transformation that we need to see in food systems. It, for the first time, really recognizes all the challenges and the negative externalities that we see in food systems. For some of the key issues, it provides quantitative targets and really has that integrated perspective that I started to talk about. But of course, the downside is that it's only aspirational, not binding yet, and it will take quite some years until the legislative framework is ready. And most importantly, what's not yet there is that the common agricultural policy is actually really reacting to these targets. So it's nothing less than frustrating to see the CAP reform as it's taking shape right now, because it's not reflecting the priorities of the EU Green Deal. And there's so much scientific evidence that it's failing, but even the EU Court of Auditors keep on criticizing the approach. But of course, there's still quite some room to shape and design how the money will be spent in agriculture. So it will be important what the member states of the EU will write down in their national plans for the common agricultural policy. And what's maybe also important to know is, that's partly also from this expert group that I talked about, there is this debate around, will there be national food strategies and what kind of targets will they set, beyond what's prescribed already in the EU strategies. But of course, there are also some areas that we don't really see yet covered. An important one that I will come back later is the reduction of animal product, both in production and consumption. That's quite an important one for sustainability. But also, like, if we want market to drive towards sustainability, then we really need the integration of the external costs that we already see in the health system and for cleaning groundwater, so in the environmental part, to see them reflected in the prices. And there's no really way yet described how that could be. I just, like, as a picture I inserted here, it's quite funny, in a German supermarket, I mean, partly this is a marketing effort, obviously, but they're showing two price tags, the one that you pay and the one you should actually pay if you integrate the prices that society already reflects. And this, like, true cost accounting, internalizing of external costs, that's something that's wildly debated, how we manage to get that done. So, but let's then, that was the reflection about, like, how ambitious is already and what's still missing. But then, if I put myself into your shoes, so what's the kind of target that we already see that do impact your business is, there's increase of organic production and partly also organic demand increase for organic products, requirements for less pesticides, requirements for less fertilizer. I haven't talked much about the packaging, but of course packaging is a huge issue, the whole plastic and single-use plastic one. That's also addressed in EU policy already, and the mentioned EU Code of Conduct for responsible business and marketing practice. So I won't really talk about that, and I'm quite sure that you heard about it in the last sessions. But I would love to give you a little idea, and that's speculation, obviously, partly, and this look in the glass ball that I mentioned is like what else may come and what that would mean for you. And there is this strong need to shift towards plant-based diets. I come back to that in a second why. And of course, if there is a policy-supported shift towards plant-based, that obviously might mean that there's a opportunity for the fresh produce market to grow in the EU. Then I will also have a look at a likely stronger focus on food losses and maybe even coming monitoring requirements. I will spend some words on the importance of regional production that we see in Europe. And I will also address the potential higher standards for importers to create a level playing field between EU producers and outside, transparency, and the whole question of shared responsibility over the supply chain. But first, to come to that question of the relevance of plant-based diets, and we have seen, and that's connected to the first slide that I've shown you about, like, the climate crisis. And if we talk about the agricultural sector and the food sector, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to climate change, then we almost only talk about high yields and increasing yields and increasing efficiency. But the two even bigger sectors, particularly if combined, or two biggest entry points, are actually to shift towards plant-rich diets and to cut food waste. And this, I mean, as you can imagine, is something that is, to change diets is nothing that policymakers really want to touch, because it usually has this connotation of, like, I don't let a policymaker tell me what's on my plate. But it's really desperately needed that we have public support to get this shift done, simply because there's so much more resources, be it water, energy, or land, invested in producing 1 calorie of animal products compared to the 5 to 10 times more plant calories you would have to directly use plant-based products, right? So this is why this is such an important area, because producing animal products is simply not an efficient use of agricultural area. So that's important to know. But there's also, that's why I mentioned, coming from the health side, there's quite a demand to shift diets to actually tackling the problem of obesity. And it was quite a interesting piece of work done 2 years ago, and widely circulated and reported by media. Maybe you have heard about it, of a group of experts that then published it in the biggest health journal, The Lancet, and it was called the Lancet Commission. And they, for the first time, tried to solve the question, how can we actually feed 10 billion people by 2050 in a healthy way and keep within the planetary boundaries? So really have that integrated perspective. And then they broke that down to a plate, what's on that plate. I mean, obviously you need to adapt it to cultures, but it gives you a good idea, because it tells you, if you have a look at now at the EU diet and the average, things on the table, then we see that there is, and that's what you see on the left-hand side of this graph, there needs to be a large increase of consumption of particularly nuts and legumes, but also fruits and vegetables, and in massive decrease actually of animal products. And that needs to be reflected by policymakers. So what that would mean, if it's then taken up, and it's not a strong part of the Farm to Fork yet, really. Obviously, it was part of the of intense debate, and it was really like watered down the last hours before it was presented. But if that shift, and we see that it's getting more political acceptance, if that is then reflected by policymakers, then what we probably see is more campaigns in favor of plant-based diets, which would be for your benefit. The second of the 4 points that I wanted to make is that we have a sustainable development goal called 12.3 to halve food waste and halve food waste by 2030, and to reduce food losses, so everything from primary production. And what we have seen so far is that there, in the whole attempts to reduce food waste, there was a strong focus on retail and consumption, but there was less focus on the primary production, and this is starting to change, and it will start to change first with trying to get the data. And I know from research projects where we try to cooperate with like retailers and food producers and food importers to the EU, that it's really that companies are very reluctant to share that data, because it's quite an amount of food losses that we see there. And of course, there's always the risk, like if you share your data, which is very important to just see where we can become more efficient, is that the blame is on the producers, right? Or you're wasting so much, though it's quite difficult, obviously, to address this problem. But it will be more in the focus in the coming years. And then there's this thing, this is probably important for, all of these companies that are, importing to the EU, is that something that we really see, and I know that you have addressed that in one of your prior sessions where you discussed the McKinsey study that showed that there is quite a demand for regional production, and this is really something that is a trend, and that is also acknowledged by the Farm to Fork strategy. So I'm reading this out. Moreover, with the view to enhance resilience of regional and local food systems, the Commission, in order to create shorter supply chains, will support reducing dependence on long-haul transportation. So this is something already in the strategy, but at the same time, in parallel, we really see this consumer demand, and I just put down here the advertisement of a German retailer. We also see that it's a important strategy of retailers to announce products, to advertise products. So this is something that is already a trend and likely to grow. And last but not least, it's still up in the discussion and not yet really solved, but all the standards that will increase for EU production will sooner or later also be requirements for imports and trade, from pesticide use to sustainable production. And it will, of course, this is important for EU producers because we need a level playing field. Elsewise, we see cheaper, not sustainable imports in the EU, and this is something that policymakers are quite aware of. We also see that there is more debate about the transparency, but also shared responsibility over the supply chain, and this will play a bigger role. Interestingly, the Unfair Trading Practices Directive, something that I haven't talked about now, but is also around as an EU directive that is just in the implementation in member states, is really trying to protect farmers actually, and to make those responsible that are higher up in the processing and retail part, because, and that partly also has impacts on food waste, for example. So the whole requirements that retailers often have to allow last-minute cancellation of contracts, for example, that is unfair for farmers. So we already have the Unfair Trading Practices Directive, and there's likely to come more to make sure that we have a shared responsibility in the supply chain. In Germany, for example, we already have something that's almost agreed yet. It's called the Supply Chain Act or Lieferkettengesetz. It's more based on human rights acts, but it is really about making sure that companies ensure that in their supply chain they have the high human rights standards. And it's just a matter of time until we see something similar on EU level. And the last point, it might also be that ahead of the UN Food System Summit that you might be aware of, that's taking place this autumn, that EU countries also will build alliances with like-minded countries to push actually for global trade rules that do promote a sustainable food system. So that's my personal look in the glass wall. I do think that anticipating that change that needs to come simply because you can't negotiate with physics and the physical environment. If you anticipate the change, it can become a competitive advantage, although I know that it's in the first place combined with a lot of costs. So that's these are my last words, maybe like closing with a quote from Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done. And now I'm looking forward to your questions, and thank you for listening.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you. That was an absolutely excellent. Right. Can you hear me now? Thanks, Stephanie. That was an excellent presentation. I've made copious pages of notes. I see we've got questions in, but I've got a few to ask myself, just by way of introduction. To those who have been on our previous sessions, my name's Leanne Jones. I'm the country manager for PMA here in South Africa. And we're very excited and pleased to have brought you this series to help you understand the EU Green Deal. And we have Stephanie with us. She has taken time out from her holiday to present and come and answer some of your questions as well. So Stephanie, I think maybe the first thing to do is just tackle some of the questions that we have there that have come through the Q&A. So, the first one is in terms of the forums, are there forums or channels for producers to add inputs to the targets and policies?
Yes, yes and no. I mean, the way how these policies are made is, usually have quite some, time ahead, and there have been like public consultations about that, where everybody was able to respond and include recommendations, obviously. There have also been quite some, bilateral, trilateral, whatever discussions with like different stakeholders, and obviously they're usually the usual ways how, well, in Europe, it's, Copa Cogeca is the kind of farmer organizations. They are very well heard and are in all the informal and formal debates. I would personally say not always for the sake of what's needed, but there are like ways to influence that. But there's not like this particular channel that I could recommend you to use, and you know, particularly since many of the activities you know, are now in the past, and now it's pretty much about like shaping on a national level how agricultural policies are developed in each of the national member states, and this is the way to go.
Perfect, thank you. I see there's a question that's coming from Lindy, and I'm going to link that together with Susan's question in terms of, do you foresee EU imports reducing in years to come off the back of the regional policy, as you know, are the policies favoring more and more local production?
Yes, I do see that for different reasons. I mean, the usual reason that is communicated in the public, that it's, you know, saving CO2 emissions due to reduced transport, that's really not the core thing in an environmental perspective. And I read out this quote from the Farm to Fork strategy that says we do want to strengthen that to reduce the dependence on long haul transportation. I think this is something that has always also been articulated, but I think it will get stronger due to resilience arguments, due to you know, improving the livelihood of EU farmers, to reconnect consumers to producers. There are a lot of other reasons like rural development, all that kind of stuff, that do speak in favor of regional production, and I seriously see this coming.
Okay, so, you know, and I think maybe a takeaway there is it's also important for quite a lot of our participants, particularly on this webinar, are producers and exporters into Europe. So that's something you need to consider in terms of your strategy. You need to understand that you need to diversify your basket or your markets that you supply to, so that your business is robust and strong as this policy potentially rolls out and could impact your business.
Yes, and I would add to what you just said, Leanne, it's of course a whole lot of this debate is like, we need then to create a level playing field, you know, between you know, EU producers and outside producers. So this is what I meant with, like, hopefully it's, you know, if you adapt early, you know, you can, you know, take up the advantage, because, you know, the sustainability standards will increase in Europe. So if you're up to this challenge, then, you know, I think, you know, there will always be imports. It's not about self-sufficiency and autonomy in Europe. It will never be. So of course there's a lot of room for imports, but the whole debate about human rights and sustainability standards and environmental protection, that will increase.
Perfect. And Lindy's just come back in and said, does the EU have the capacity to be self-sufficient?
They're different. It's a good question. There are different modelings, right? And you could take the input output, right? I mean, it's you know, if you talk about self-sufficiency in terms of autonomy, then obviously we always would be self-sufficient, but with an absolutely different diet, right? And this is nothing that will get political backing to just like close borders, and I think it's also not helpful. So, but in terms of like the calories we produce, it's not a problem. And also the level of diversification. Currently, we produce way too much animal products, which is also a kind of waste of resources, if you put it that way, because you could obviously, you know, use the plant calories directly, much more efficient as human food, right? So yes, the EU would be able to be self-sufficient with changed consumer habits that particularly go hand in hand with food waste reduction and with less animal products. But I mean, this is a bit of like, you know, knowing what would be theoretically possible, but I don't think we go in this direction. But of course, the pandemic also has put this topic to the agenda as well. Like, you know, like with, I mean, the food system kept up pretty well, you know, whoa, quite surprisingly also. But, you know, the danger was always real. We had the trucks on the French, UK borders, on the German, Polish borders, whatever. And it was just hard management that everything went that smoothly, or almost smoothly as it did. And you could see that it's not just a theoretical threat.
Yeah, super. I'm going to run through some of the other questions we have. I'm going to go back to one of our topics that is very reoccurring with our members. It's about packaging. I know you did refer to it, you skipped over it a bit. Maybe you can do a little bit of a recap. You know, I think some of our producers, exporters are a little bit sure, literally which direction to go. Our packaging options in South Africa are quite limited. What do you believe will happen in this area? Where do they need to focus their attention on?
Yes, I mean, of course, always a little disclaimer. I'm not a packaging expert, so I follow this, discussion obviously also on the side, but still from this following on the side, what I see is, we had this discussion about like packaging in Europe and plastic, and went for a bit of a, I think, strange approach to ban like single-use plastic and very particular ones. So not really the packaging stuff that was part like what you usually have in supermarkets, right? So that's really not included, which is a bit of like what's politically feasible. So let's agree on the stuff that nobody is really hurted. So but this, I mean, will probably change, so that the whole fruit packaging, the whole food product packaging will be addressed. And the challenges there are that a lot of the solutions out there are not really fit for recycling, right? Because they're using different components. And a lot of what we also see in the out-of-home sector is they're choosing now stuff that looks environmentally friendly, because it has partly that paper stuff, but is even more harmful than the stuff they used before, because they obviously still need, this other layer that is, protecting then the fruit and the food inside. So the whole thing of making it fit for recycling, using like single components and not like merging everything, that will be a key issue. And then obviously then our infrastructure in Europe also needs to be fit for recycling, because usually we collect stuff, it is recyclable, but in the end is burned. So this is, something that will happen, needs to happen in parallel. And for you, I understand, this challenge to use less packaging, to use this recyclable packaging, and also then deal with the challenge of, packaging is usually also used for marketing, right? From this is an organic product to this is actually our brand, right? And this is tricky to do. I mean, for organic, I've seen like examples where it's like a kind of brand on the product itself, on the cucumber, cool. But you're just very restricted in the stuff you can communicate without packaging. So this is really also a marketing challenge, right? It's not just an environmental challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie. And then I wanted to bring something up from one of our earlier conversations, excuse me, that you and I had, was about coming back to that shared responsibility. And I know you touched on it. And quite a lot of the narrative that comes through sometimes is that it's always pushed back to that grower, always pushed back to the farmer. Maybe expand a little bit more. I like that example, what was happening in Germany, but do you see how it's going to be shared, this responsibility, or managed more, that it's not just, everyone has to do this, but will it be policed a little bit so that there is sort of a body in place to make sure that those people or those middlemen or people in the supply chain are not just saying the right things, but are still pushing back quite a lot of the requirements to the growers and the exporters?
Yes. There are probably at least two sides to your question. And the one thing is, do growers have, is there more this shared responsibility, right?
Yes.
And the other thing is, will growers actually be able to kind of fight better for their rights, right? So, to push actually in that direction, right? Not just like, what's there in theory, but also like, if it doesn't happen, how can I react and be heard? And both is taking place. And we do see that, I mean, we are not yet sure how the national implementation of the unfair trading practice directive that we have now since 2 years on the EU level, which was, I mean, I touched on that, but it was really quite an interesting development, because it was coming from the European Commission, from the agriculture side. They did see that, the agricultural producers don't really they can't really fight, so to say, against, you know, retailers' demands, and just get all the burden and low prices and can't really do anything about that. So this was quite a significant political shift. And now the question is like how this is implemented on the national level. And what we already do see in the UK, it's established already since a longer time. And we get this such a body now in Germany as well. I don't know about all the other member states, but this is going to take place. That we have like, God, whatever that is in English, ombudsman. So like service centers, whatever, where you can anonymously also say like, oh, I do see this practice from my retailer. And it's not fair. It's against this unfair trading practice, for example, or other legislation. And then they will follow up and also have the legal requirements to put your kind of punishments, whatever, like also like fees up to that. And this is something that is, I think, really needed because the market, we have such a market concentration, and obviously with that concentration there goes a lot of power to give that, you know, back to agriculture producers. And this is gladly something that we do see in Europe, and that is also applied to those who import to Europe. And I think this is a very good thing, right? Because obviously as a grower, you need some room to maneuver and need to react on if there are unfair trading practices.
Perfect. Thanks, Stephanie. Tanasha has posted a question here, and we touched on a little bit earlier about, there was Lindy's comment. We talked about the policies to favor local production, and then also about getting your advantage or that first mover advantage to prepare for this. But then, you know, the question goes on is that what we start seeing with the farm to fork strategy would lead to offshoring of bad production, especially those value chain actors that are unable to comply and then opt to export to third markets in Middle East and Asia and the Far East. So, you know, maybe there's, you know, let me hand that over to you. And then Tanasha, if you've got something more to add or ask after Stephanie's gone through that question, please post it in the comments.
Yes, maybe a question back because I was not able to read and listen at the same time. So is it about the EU will then import stuff that's not according to the sustainability criteria, or is it that EU producers will then, I don't know, not, you know, deliver to the EU market, but to other markets?
So I think, Tanash, I'm going to explain it as I understand it. And if I've explained it the wrong way, please add in your comments as well. What I sort of understand is that if you are not producing to the requirements or the standards of the EU, you're not going to get your products into the market. And so, you know, you're either going to have, you know, producers or exporters exporting into Europe, and that gets turned away and then it has to be redirected, or it's just definitely going to be blocked so that you can't put your product in. So, you know, there is that thought that you need to diversify your markets, both from the fact that the EU might be looking to have more local production, but also the standards are going to be different from sustainability, ethical, everything in the farm to fork, so that if you are not complying to those standards, you're not going to have access to sell your products in the EU. I think that, am I explaining Tanasha's question, I think, in the right way?
Yes, and it's partly probably a comment, right? Because also, yes, this is a consideration you will have, right? You know, it's like, what does that mean to me? Am I trying to, you know, to try to reach these standards and have access, or how do I diversify my other markets? But I would add another consideration here, which is, I mean, of course, the EU is an important market, but the EU is also an important actor in setting standards. So I would be very surprised if we increase standards and the rest of the world is simply ignoring that, right? I mean, particularly since they're simply reacting to really pressing, urgent societal needs that are international. So I think it's just a matter of time. I mean, you know, living in Germany, obviously, I always come up with these German examples, but we had the first Renewable Energy Act that really supported wind energy in a densely populated country without a lot of wind. And we became like, you know, well, champions in wind energy, and actually the legislation then got copied in China and the rest of the world, right? So these kind of standards will obviously also impact the international scene. So I think it's not really like EU or other things, but it's also like, you know, trying to anticipate what's going to happen, and it probably will happen first in the EU.
Super. And, you know, that's just to reiterate that in, you know, preparing this series and putting it together and speaking to different thought leaders and experts, we've also heard that same commentary, that this is starting in the EU, but it's really sort of the blueprint to move globally. So this is the blueprint for other countries and the world to sort of move in this direction. So you know, it's the same sort of conversation that we're having with other thought leaders, that this is going to sort of, you know, become a global phenomena that companies need to adhere to. Super. We've got a couple more questions from Fred. Here we go. He's talking about regenerative farming principles. Are they looked upon favorably as a method to solve the main areas of concern and Green Deal drivers?
So the question is like, are regenerative farming practices something
looked upon favorably? Is
yes.
that something part of what you see coming through?
Yes. Absolutely, and it's actually quite funny that you use that term of regenerative farming practices, because the whole wording and the whole narratives behind it are actually part of the debate as well. Because I or many others would say, like, I mean, regenerative farming, that's a good term as well, depending on how you interpret it. I mean, it would be much clearer if we would say agroecology, and the agroecological principles are the ones that we need. But I know that many actors use the phrase regenerative farming, and there is a bit of a danger that it's a new buzzword for the same old practices. This is what I would see. So really be clear of what you, in what context you're using the term. We had the same thing about like sustainable intensification, and sustainable intensification is something that you don't really, well, I don't use as a word, because it has been hijacked by those who want to keep up the status quo and don't really change agricultural practices. So yes, it is there. It's a lot, by the way, about also carbon sequestration in soils, and how we find ways to also support a way that keeps a lot of carbon in the soil, and these are regenerative practices. We also look for like market measures on carbon credits, how this could how this could be dealt with. It's quite tricky. I can already say that it could also go in the wrong direction. But yes, this is something that is even not a political debate anymore. So regenerative farming practices, good. Seen by everyone, agreed by everyone.
Good. Right, I'm going to go through to Nook's question here. What is or are the key takeaways that other countries can learn from the EU Green Deal? What is the place for them to start? What would be your top takeaways? Where can they focus their thoughts and energies to get going in this space?
Yes, that's a good question, God. Particularly, maybe I'm just sharing like what's going through my head here. I mean, it's really good that we have the Green Deal, right? It's setting really high and ambitious targets. So target setting is a good thing. So, you know, and particularly starting with these targets that are most crucial and actually quite easy to measure, which is climate, right? So CO2 is something, you know, that's easy also to address, particularly compared to, let's say, biodiversity, right? Which you can't really measure because all these worms and bugs in soil, for example, or under the sea are just like hard to count, right? So that's a good thing. And the second thing that is going through my head is like, you know, it was pretty much a top-down thing, right? It's like we now have our EU man on the moon moment. This is how Ursula von der Leyen put it. And this is true, right? It's really this man on the moon moment because it is such a difficult and good endeavor, right? But now the question is like, how do we get it done in practice? And this is something that I would think we're not really perfectly set up in Europe, because we don't really have this open debate between practice actors and science actors and policy, well, decision makers, how this could look like. We still have interest groups that fight for one thing and fight for the other thing and don't really get out of their positions and look for ways to deal with that are future proof and that are not just a compromise. I try to actively avoid the word compromise because you cannot negotiate with planetary boundaries, right? So you better set a future target and you develop backcasting, that's how we call that, ways how to get there. And obviously you always have room to set different ways to that target, but really take these ambitious targets. There's no way to deal with that in the future with continuing status quo, and particularly if you have children, really keep that in mind. It's really something that we need to do. So I hope that the two things, like, yes, ambitious targets, but then actually really sitting down with how this could look like in practice together with scientists, and then prescribe that in legislation and get a good monitoring, right? A good monitoring is essential, elsewise it will simply stay on the level of strategies and targets, and that's not enough.
And then, Stephanie, if you took that down to, let's say, our producers, where would you say, the guy who's growing his cucumbers, his apples, the lady, sorry, growing her cucumbers and her apples, what would you say, where should they focus on to start within their business, making that change on the ground level?
Yes. Good question. And I'm always trying to, get my mind around like who's now listening and who actually needs to implement that. A tricky thing that we also see right now in practice in EU, and I don't know obviously much about like outside the EU, how it's dealt with, that even the education of practice actors is not fit for the future. And also not the agricultural advisory services that we already do have are fit for these future challenges, right? So it's really a double challenge for these practice actors because, a lot of stuff that they have learned and a lot of the advice they get is not fit for the challenge. So a key challenge really is to look for these peers that already work with these challenges because they're really pioneers, right? And you do find them, you do find a lot of them, but there is no organized exchange of information yet. So it's really this active looking of like, who has a similar situation, like in terms of also regional climate, markets, etc., and to set up yourself, and maybe PMA also is a good way to start there, right? Set up ways for exchanging that information, how it could be done, because it will be a lot about experimentation also. Like, for example, if we talk about, what kind of like rare species, right? And all that kind of stuff, like you need to see, like you adapt also to the crisis and try out new things. And it will be a lot of trial and error. And you need to, help each other. It's a lot about cooperation in this case.
Super, thank you. And Stephanie, I'm just going to move to the last question. I know we're coming up to the hour quite rapidly. It's from Henk. How do you measure your sustainable farming practices and also your contribution to the sustainable food system throughout the supply chain?
Whoever that Henk is, that's a very good question. And it's really needed that we find ways how to measure the performance, how to monitor the performance, and we don't have these tools yet at hand. You find easy like what you produce and what you sell, and what costs you invest and what benefit is there in terms of monetary and return of investment. But for the other important dimensions that we're talking about in terms of sustainability, we don't have these systems set up. So that's discussed intensively on EU level, how this could look like. Also that it doesn't create a lot of burden in terms of administrative burden. I have a German example, which is fantastic. It's actually on the producer level by a company called Regionalwert AG, and they have produced really a benchmarking standard that helps you to assess that you also like, what do you already deliver for society? But it's again these pioneers who do that and also take this currently now on the EU level. But unfortunately to conclude that there is no proper system in place. I'm sorry to say that. So again, here it needs the pioneers and follow the science that usually comes up with cool tools in the first place. And yes, try to get active without that stuff that you need already being in place.
Perfect. Well, I've got to say some good news from PMA is that we are putting in place a sustainability toolkit to help our members at least measure where they are, so they can track their sustainability efforts, and when they make progress on it, they can keep that track and keep going forward. So, you know, I know it's not a global toolkit, but we're putting something in there. And we're also doing another piece of work at the moment where we're taking all the order requirements on the sustainability side, and we're going to be doing a comparison. So our growers and our members understand that when they're doing some work, you know, what are the different audits that, you know, that covers when they put that investment into their business. Super. I think that's all of our questions from the audience. Stephanie, thank you so much for your time today. It's been incredibly valuable. Very, very much mind-opening. You know, I go back to that 700 million people starving in the world with 2 billion people overweight.
Yes, it's not really how to feed the world. We could
No.
feed the world and up to 12 billion people already. So
absolutely. You know,
yeah.
Things have to change so that we can all survive and, you know, have a good prospect, particularly for our children as well. So thank you very much for your time today. For those who have attended today, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your inputs. Your questions have been great. If you have anything that we've missed out, please drop me an email, pop it onto the Fresh Ed platform as well, and we can circle back to Stephanie and see if we can get some answers fed back to you on that as well. But thank you again, Stephanie, for your time today. It's been an excellent session.
Thanks all for your questions.
All right. Bye-bye.